With every passing season in the NBA, we continue to see record-breaking contracts handed out to players that most of us would ever dream of seeing in our lifetimes earning. An insane $100 million contract from 10 years ago is now seen as commonplace in today's NBA, with deals now exceeding $250 million, and we even got to witness our first ever contract that exceeded $300 million for Jaylen Brown. A great player, definitely an all-star and a player a lot of teams would love to have on their roster, but not a superstar, not a top 10 player in the NBA, but getting paid like the best player in the world. In the 24-25 season, Jaylen Brown will be getting paid $52.4 million, while some of his teammates will be getting paid less than $2 million. But is Jaylen Brown really 26 times the player than those who are on minimum deals? Probably not, but that's the reality we face in the NBA today. And while it's been the case for a while in the extreme gap in pay between the ludicrous contracts being handed out to players who probably aren't worth that kind of money they're getting, it's only going to continue to get worse and become an even bigger problem for the NBA going forward. As always, if you're new to the channel and you enjoy this type of content, then I would greatly appreciate it if you subscribe to help the channel grow so you don't miss a video as well, and in return I'll be providing more NBA content like this. Now, I've had a lot of people asking me recently, how could someone like Jaylen Brown receive the largest contract in NBA history in excess of $3 million, more money than players like his own teammate Jason Tatum, Nikola Jokic, Giannis, Steph Curry, Joel Embiid, Luka Doncic, the greatest players in the league? Well, the answer is fairly simple, because the Celtics didn't have much of a choice. Yes, they could have looked to trade him and avoid giving him a big payday, but a trade that would likely mean getting less in return for an established player, star player like Jaylen Brown. Yes, you could have received a fair amount of draft compensation for him in a trade, but for the Celtics, being a team looking to win now, that isn't going to be of interest to them. And yes, the Celtics could have let the final year of his deal play out in this upcoming season, see how he performs, see how the Celtics do as a team, and offer him an extension before he becomes an unrestricted free agent next July, which for the record, I personally think that would have made the most sense for them to do. But doing that, you also run the risk of creating tension between Brown and the front office in wavering on offering him a contract extension when he was eligible for one. And then finally, the reason Brown received such a large deal is that because he was selected to an All-NBA team last season, that instantly made him eligible for a Supermax contract extension compared to the max, which is a significant percentage more over the life of the deal. But the crux of it is this: because of the way the NBA salary cap is structured and the parameters around bird rights, exceptions, luxury tax implications, the Celtics were more or less forced into a situation in which they had to offer Jaylen Brown the deal without losing him for nothing as a free agent next offseason, or losing him for little value in the form of a trade when they already have a contending team on their hands. And in there lies the problem in the NBA as it relates to teams being forced into what we call the bird rights trap. Now, you've probably heard this term bird rights, a team having a player's bird rights, early bird rights, or non-bird rights. Now, I'll try to briefly explain it, as I'm sure some of you already know how this works, but essentially, the rule of bird rights started back in 1983 when the NBA first instituted a salary cap to level the playing field among the league. Prior to that, there was no salary cap, and you had the richest teams being able to pay for the best talent in the NBA. Well, the problem with the salary cap is that if you acquire enough talent through the draft, you eventually get to a place where you simply cannot afford to keep the best talent on your roster despite having drafted them. Now, that still sometimes is the case to this day, but the benefit of bird rights is that it enables a team to keep their players by, one, the ability to offer them more money than any team around the league, and two, it also gives them the ability to use the player's salary to operate over the cap. Thus, teams are able to retain their best players without having to worry about them leaving in free agency for more money because their current team couldn't afford to keep them, which is good, right? Teams should have the advantage of being able to retain their talent and not lose them because of a hard cap. And while yes, that is good, the problem though is you run into a situation where teams are being forced to keep certain players even if it really doesn't make them all that much better, because they would essentially be worse off in losing said player. Let's take one example from this offseason and something I'm very familiar with as a Bulls fan. The Chicago Bulls extended Nikola Vucevic to a 3-year deal worth $60 million, fully guaranteed, no team option or partial guarantees. Now, you can debate whether or not Vucevic was worth that kind of money at his age and slightly declining production, but the fact of the matter is Vucevic, who was set to become an unrestricted free agent, would have left the team and the Bulls would have received nothing in return. Now, sometimes that's good. You don't re-sign a player who was on a large contract. Maybe they weren't providing the value needed to the team. Not saying that was the case for Vucevic and the Bulls, just using it as an example. You don't need them, and then boom, you free up all the cap space they were taking up as a result. Well, not really. Not when you're already an over-the-cap team. And in this instance for the Bulls, they were an over-the-cap team. In fact, a team that was close to the luxury tax. By letting Vucevic walk for nothing, they would lose him and not gain any sort of cap relief in return. They would still have been over the cap and wouldn't have been able to replace Vucevic by signing other free agents outside of using the mid-level exception or the biannual exception. And Vucevic is still a far better player than those who would otherwise get a mid-level deal as a free agent. And then in the case of the Bulls, you then used your full mid-level exception for a Vucevic replacement, which leaves you with very little to work with in bringing in other free agents when you've used your exceptions and already operating over the cap. Whereas re-signing Vucevic, because you have his bird rights, it enables you to keep him, remain over the cap, and still have the ability to use your exceptions to sign other free agents around the league. To an extent, this was the same case with Jaylen Brown. Even though it was an early extension and they could have waited, the fact of the matter is the Celtics, as they currently stand, are an over-the-cap team, a luxury tax team, and even if they lost Jaylen Brown, they say, you know what, he's a great player, but he's not worth a Supermax contract, we can't justify it, let's let him walk, and we'll free up a ton of cap space as a result. They wouldn't have been able to free up any cap space by letting Jaylen Brown walk. They would still be over the cap, and they would have little to work with in improving the team outside of trades and exceptions. So when you look at this from a financial perspective, and where the league is going as it relates to paying star-level talent compared to rotational players, and especially with the new CBA that limits and disincentivizes teams from going too far over the luxury tax, the NBA's structure for paying players and a team's ability to pay their players while trying to compete and continuing to get better is inherently flawed, especially when it comes to the max and supermax contract, because really there are only maybe 6 or 7 players in the whole league that are actually worth that amount. For NBA teams, you're operating in a cap system, but you have to keep guys like Jaylen Brown or even some of the rookie deals that were handed out this past offseason, Desmond Bane, LaMelo Ball. You have to keep these guys and pay them like they're Giannis or Jokic, or lose them for nothing or trade them for picks for lesser players. So in reality, teams are being forced, almost penalized if you will, in that if their own player becomes an all-star or is even a fringe all-star, you have to pay them like a top player in the league so you don't lose their bird rights and have to start over and trying to bring in the same level of talent through the draft. Yes, the salary cap will continue to go up year after year, making certain max contracts look more favorable over time, but now, with the new CBA and removing teams' ability to use their full mid-level exception if they're above the second tax apron, it's going to make it more challenging for teams to move on from these massive contracts in the form of a trade should things not work out for that player or they become disgruntled as a team, as teams are going to be unwilling to take on high salaries for guys who aren't superstars, unless, maybe it's a year left on their deal, maybe 2 years, which then leaves the team stuck with a mid-tier or fringe level all-star player making superstar level money and being stuck to improve their team further because of the amount of money one player is eating up on their payroll. And to be honest, I don't really know how the NBA is going to solve for this, because the other rule being implemented with the new CBA is a minimum game requirement for all major regular season awards, including all NBA selections, the minimum threshold being 65. And a handful of players who were selected to the All-NBA team this past season played less than 65 games. Guys like Giannis, Steph, LeBron James, Damian Lillard, Jimmy Butler all played less than 65 games. All players who were selected to an All-NBA team would not be eligible going forward, and thus would not be eligible for Supermax contract extensions, paving the way for lesser talented stars to be selected to an All-NBA team and being eligible for the Supermax, even though just because they are eligible for the Supermax doesn't mean that they're going to get it, but some teams will be forced to do so, as to not strain the relationship with their player by offering them a lesser deal, which was likely the case of Jaylen Brown, and we will only continue to see this going forward with these massive deals for players who are not that guy, not that number one option, not that game changer. And I truly believe the problem is only going to continue to get worse over time. I would love to hear what you guys think, though. Let me know in the comments on your thoughts on the financial structure of the NBA and the implications of the new CBA. As always, be sure to subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.